Welcome back to our ivy-covered virtual halls of academia here at the Apartment Academy, the multifamily industry's only operations-focused podcast and your Institute of Higher NOI. I'm your host, the Dean of the Apartment Academy, Daniel Cunningham, and today's lecturer is Moshe Crane. Moshe is VP of Branding and Strategic Initiatives at Sage Ventures, and if you want to know what that means, it means that Moshe tries to figure out how to do everything that multifamily operators need to do in the most efficient way possible. And that was the subject of our discussion today. Operational efficiency, centralization, whatever you want to call it. If you've been wondering what that really means and how you can really go about it, we've got some good stepping stones today to lead you on that journey. Here is Professor Crane. All right, well, it is very nice to have you here on campus, Professor Crane. Thanks for joining us here at the Apartment Academy. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for including me in the academy.
You're welcome. So Moshe Crane, you are VP of Branding and Strategic Initiatives at Sage Ventures, which is an interesting title. I'd say probably not common, especially in a company of your size. Tell us a little bit about Sage Ventures and how that role has become so prominent within a kind of a mid-sized company like Sage.
So when I started at Sage, I started as the director of leasing and marketing back in August 2018. At the time, we had 1,800 units, and that was my lane. And we grew, we acquired more properties, and the more I, would learn about the industry and operations, the hungrier I got, and the more I wanted to learn, the more I started swerving out of my lane and diving into things much further than just leasing and marketing. And so, but I kept getting pushed back into my lane. And at some point, I went to discuss with the president that I felt that I would be able to give more value if I would actually take a step back from the director of leasing and marketing and shift over to an area where I can really help make things more efficient and smoother and better in all areas. Now, branding has nothing to do with that. I happen to be the head of marketing, which was focused on property marketing, and I run our LinkedIn page. So as a company, and the company had seen benefits from that. We had a handful of people who came to work for us because they liked what they saw on LinkedIn, and there were owners and investors that were talking to the owners of the company about how much they liked to see what was going on at the company. And so the company wanted me to expand on that. So now I focus on company branding versus property branding and the strategic initiatives. Instead of just focusing on leasing and marketing on a site level, I work directly with the president on initiatives in all areas.
Broadly, yes. And so was the leasing and marketing role at Sage, was that your first foray into multifamily?
Yes. So I started in commercial real estate. I'm blinking on the year now, but about, I guess 2014, leasing office and warehouse space. And at that time, I didn't think I would get into the multifamily space. But after 2.5 years working leasing office and warehouse space, I went to work for a supplier. And after that, I wanted to come back to the owner side. And it just happened to be with Sage that they had just created the position. They never had somebody in the position.
And Sage, tell us a little bit about the Sage as a company, focused purely on multifamily, regionally. Tell us a little bit about you guys.
So Sage is based in Baltimore. The owner started very small. It was buying, 20, 30 unit class C and D stuff in Baltimore City. And I guess the niche a little bit was that the owner always had an interest in construction and development as well. So he would go after projects, deals that others kind of shied away from. So like one of our properties we sold a few years ago was like a 330 unit deal that half of the property was out. There was a flood. There was something that knocked out, half the community, and a lot of people didn't want to touch that. And he was, I guess, brave enough to venture towards doing that. And over time, he actually developed. There's a development arm, so we develop townhome communities, condos. All those are for sale projects. So each home is sold individually. But that is an arm that has developed as well. We actually have our first project where the two divisions are together. We're doing a ground up lease up. So our development arm is building the community, and our management has taken over and is leasing and managing it.
Very good. And it seems apropos that you're in charge of the branding side, because you certainly have a penchant for asking questions on LinkedIn. I think predominantly, sort of trying to poke the market a little bit to kind of elicit a response. In some senses, self-serving in that you, as head of strategic initiatives, I'm sure you want to understand, like, what is the market doing, what are the best practices in all these different areas that you explore. But another part of it just seems like that's just Moshe. That's just like you are an inquisitive person and intellectually curious, and you want to know what's going on. So I would be very interesting today to hear some of your thoughts on kind of just operations in general. There's the last a couple years, really almost since COVID, there's been a greater focus on operational efficiency. We see that on the Leonardo side, certainly a bit. And my thesis is that what COVID did was two sort of sea changes that we didn't see coming. One is, we pulled people off site in a way that we never would have before collectively, and we survived that. Now, we have returned people to on-site, but not in the same way that I would say pre-COVID. But what we learned is that there are ways, should you choose to do so, to be able to accomplish some of the operational items that in the past, like leasing, that we thought, well, you have to have somebody on site for that. You simply must have somebody to. We learned that's not necessarily the case. There are options to do these things in a virtual manner, and so that was one change. And the second change is that our demographic of potential employees, people that want to work in this industry, decreased, because a lot of those folks discovered work from home options that pay similar amounts, don't have the same level of stress, don't have the same level of responsibility, sometimes don't have the same level of peril, if you will, of what it's like to be on site. And so we are having a dearth of maintenance and property managers, and so we're having to figure out how to do more with less. Those two things feel permanently ensconced now in our industry and have forced us to think more about operational efficiency. How can we do more with less? I know it was a very broad opening for you, Moshe, but let's start there and let's talk about, in your intellectual curiosity, as you have probed these matters on LinkedIn and elsewhere, what's foremost on people's minds right now with what they want to accomplish in operational efficiency, and what do you think is the most important thing that can be done right now?
So first, how I got into the whole curiosity thing was, when I started my position, in hindsight, the best thing is they didn't give me a lot of direction. And so I had to figure a lot out on my own. And the company was, relatively smaller, definitely, half the size we are now. And there were a lot of folks that were in their position that were also like figuring it out. So a lot of it came from, I wanted to know, what are other people doing? I wanted to learn, what does this mean? What is that? What's GPR? What is, loss to lease? All these different terms. I wanted to understand it. At the same time, around 2020, I started a journey of listening to audiobooks. There was a book that I listened to called Measure What Matters. And that book was very interesting to me. It was about OKRs, objectives and key results. And I made a shift based on that, and it worked, and it was helpful. And it was like, what else can I learn that could help me? And so that really began the curiosity of wanting to learn, become a sponge. I think I had it naturally, but in the regards of multifamily. So there was a book that really was impactful to me, was called Think Again by Adam Grant. And that idea is, there are things that we learn in school, not in the apartment academy and other schools, and we just kind of take it for granted, and we don't adjust, we don't reassess it if that is still true or if it was even true in the first place. And the whole thought process is also is don't take things at face value, assess, does this make sense? Does it not make sense? And so that's really been my mindset for all things in multifamily. So like when you make a statement about, people, not needing to be on site for leasing, or people were making these changes in COVID, in our industry, it's really hard to know you could hear, people talking about that, but was that really what everybody was doing, or is that just what some of the people who are noisy talking about are actually doing? So just like skeptically, there's, a handful of self-guided tour companies in our market. I have a hard time believing that they're servicing more than 30% of the market right now. I think there's a lot of space. So people could say, oh, everybody's going in this direction, but it's a huge market and it's very fragmented, and it's hard, I think, to really have a good sense of how many people are really using these self-guided tours or not, or if that's the answer or not. So I believe in our industry, there's too much, I call it headline reading. So there'll be a headline, there's a topic, right? Centralization, or, people working remotely, or whatever it might be. And then people kind of go with that. And it's like, wait a second, I hear people are talking about this. This is the headline, but is that really what everybody's doing? Does that really make sense? Does that align with us? Do I align with that? And to really question that. So a lot of my curiosity has evolved over, like, I do just want to know what other people are doing, because I'm not going to just accept the headline as the truth.
I love that. We have internally, when I wear my other hat when I'm on the Leonardo side, one of the core values that we have is to think smart. And I think what is intrinsic to that is to think again. The last thing I want to ever hear anybody say from my company is, well, that's the way we've always done it, or that's the way I was taught. I'm like, well, think again. Is that really the best way to do things? So that makes a lot of sense to me. And the centralization headline, as you put it, in particular, I think warrants, some testing of that theory. Talk a little about that. What centralization right now, when people talk about that, Moshe, what do you think they're talking about?
So there's another book, and I don't even know the name of it, but the truth is I didn't actually even listen to the book. It was just an idea, and it was about being a market leader. And the idea was that to be a market leader, you have to be the best in one of three categories, and you can't stink in the other two. And that is best product, customer service, and operational efficiency. And so I thought to myself, okay, we are typically buying properties. We can't stink at product, but our North Star can't be that we want to be the best product, because at the end of the day, there's not that big of a difference between our property and the property across the street. We can't stink at it though. Customer service, can't stink at that. But again, there are going to be plenty of residents that are going to move that are beyond our control. They're buying a house, they're relocating, they have some life event. Can't stink at it, but I don't think that should be our North Star. And then it was operational efficiency, was that we can control. That has to be our North Star. That is, what can we control and what can we go after? So centralization, I think I initially have had a very bad taste from it, because it feels like, first of all, it should be rebranded, but to operational efficiency, not centralization. Centralization is a tactic to be more efficient, but it really felt like it's coming from the tech community to sell us a product, right? They're telling us how we need to operate, and that we need their tools in order to operate in that new world. And maybe there's some truth to that, maybe there's not. But to me, that the whole thing is being more efficient. So I actually had a great conversation. There's a fellow in Portland, Oregon, Jim Rostell, and he runs a really great company. Their properties are on the smaller side, so they don't have anybody on site. I think their largest property is 75 units. I think everything is under 100 units. They have nobody on site, but they don't do self-guided tours. They have a team, I think, of 3 that answer all leads. That's email leads, text leads, and phone leads. And so their job is to respond to those and schedule appointments. And then there's a team, I think, of 5 leasing specialists, that are agents that meet on site, conduct the tour, and are closing the deal. And then there's one person who's doing all the admin work for leasing, who does the screening, approval, and the lease signing. And so, I asked him, how come you don't do any self-guided tours? And he said, because self-guided tours convert at a rate somewhere around 22%. His in-person tours are converting at 55%. So he said, why would I switch to that? So he has a very centralized operation, but that doesn't mean he's taking out the human aspect. And when I asked him, well, what if somebody says to you that that's what residents prefer? He said, residents also prefer to have 3 months of free rent. Doesn't mean it's a good idea to give it to them. So they might say that they want this. And again, is it true or is it not true? Like, what is the data? My experience on site, most prospects prefer the in-person tour. Are there people who do want it? Is there a need for self-guided? Of course. I'm not here to say that there's no need for it or it doesn't play a role, but I just don't buy into the narrative that that is what everything should be. So when it comes to centralization, I think a lot of people just think of it like that. They think of a larger company and saying, instead of having 10 assistant managers on site doing collections and renewals, let's have 2 people at corporate doing that. Or it's really just like taking things away from the people on site and grouping it. Now, I think there's a lot of unknowns or tricky parts to that. So these companies which are, you have somebody in one lane and that's all they do. I'm a mixture of like new school and old school thinking. The old school of somebody coming in at leasing, working their way up to assistant manager, property manager, regional manager. I'm a big believer in that because I don't, if you're really great at sales, you should be selling something else than leasing apartments. And I believe the best property managers and regional managers are going to be someone who's one had the experience on site and they understand all the different aspects of the business. So when you're separating this and everything is specialized, then how do you have a property manager who went up from leasing to assistant manager to property manager? I just don't see it being successful hiring somebody as a property manager who hasn't worked on site before.
So even in the example you just gave, to be able to share leasing agents requires a sort of somewhat dense grouping of assets that allows people to travel, right? And I'm not even sure how common that is. Um, and it's not something that's necessarily fixed by scale. You can have a gray star who still doesn't have enough units or properties in a given MSA to be able to support even sharing leasing agents. So I agree. It is not something that is a given, and it does have a little more sizzle right now than maybe practicality. Um, and I think this is especially true on the maintenance front. I think this idea that that you can have a pod of maintenance people who you, through workforce automation, can then be scheduled to be at this property at 9 a.m. and then over there at 1 o'clock, highly impractical for almost all portfolios. I mean, just the drive time between them screws up all the efficiencies that I think you think you're going to gain from that. How does that sit with you, that idea?
Yeah, well, when I think of it is, you know, I just think maintenance as a whole has not get received the attention and the love that it deserves. So when I was in my lane of director of leasing and marketing, I didn't think much of maintenance at all. In my new lane, um, I'm obsessed with maintenance. It's half of our staff on site. It's practically all of our expenses on site, and having an understanding of that. So we spent a lot of time building some manual reports to just have a better idea and figure out the indicators of where we need to improve. So we broke out our expenses by category, which is typical in a T12. Your daily operating expenses, your utilities, your contracts, your payroll, your general admin, your taxes, license, and insurance, and capex, and then you compare those, year over year. So we were comparing 2023 and 2022, and then we compared on a per unit level. So then we lined up our communities and said, this is the DOE per unit across our portfolio. And then you start to ask questions like, why is there such a big range? Why is this community so low? Why is this one so high? And some of the answers are utilities. Like some of our properties, the water is through taxes and license and insurance because however the county's set up, it's a county thing, so it's a tax thing versus it being in the utilities. Okay, but you're going to get a lot of interesting questions and answers when you do that exercise and have a better understanding of what you're paying per unit on the low end of your portfolio versus the high end of your portfolio. So in terms of centralizing, like I mean, again, as you get bigger, you should have somebody who's specializing in figuring out your purchasing or your contracts. There's so many things that maintenance does on an individual basis or in a silo at your community that, maybe you should centralize your contracts to, have one person who's bidding these out who can compare them apples to apples. This is what we're seeing when we started to do these exercises of comparing property to property. because we realize that each property is just operating in its silo, and it's like, oh, well, it works within this budget, but in the big picture, like, we don't need to be spending this, or we're doing so much better at this property. And then you get into purchasing, and you get into all sorts of things, which again doesn't have to be a pod of people going to service different properties, but you could have certain people who are helping streamline that, your contracts, your purchasing. Those are just two topics that come to mind in terms of maintenance.
Yeah, this is good. Normally, when you talk, if you were to broach the subject of somebody and try to talk about OKRs with respect to maintenance, you're just going to get crickets. You guys have actually thought about this, taken a look at them. How about have you? I'm just curious. Have you looked at? I don't know if you're geographically dispersed enough to look at maintenance costs on a geographic basis, or age of the asset class, anything like that you're looking at.
So I think we're in the early innings of our process of understanding this. It was first by category and per unit and all that. And we've had a lot of good come from that in terms of separating it based on age and things like in geographic area. I mean, there's certain geographics that we've already discovered, which has to do with taxes and things like that. And then the style of community is going to affect insurance and things and contracts as well. So we definitely have a ways to go, but if you're just, well, let's stick on maintenance. Is when it comes to leasing, everybody has a report of like how many leases the leasing agents are getting, right? You have a scorecard for them. How many people are looking at that in regards to maintenance. You have, let's just say you're going with the 1 per 100, but what's the output you're getting from them, right? If you're not even like, you can't even begin to work on your diet if you don't get on the scale, right? So if you have a way to get on the scale and say, this amount of, you look at, oh, your work orders are getting completed, but at one property, the average maintenance person is completing 2 compared to the other ones every 1. Right. So how come they're getting so much more output? Well, they have more work orders. Well, if they have more work orders, maybe we don't need as many people over here if we're not spending as much time on maintenance because it's a newer property or something along those lines. And so I think that there's so much that's not even on people's radars, or maybe it is on their radars. It just doesn't get the attention. It's not in the headlines.
Yeah, I think there's some reticence because the on-site staff in many ways are so precious. Like, we just could never find another person to do this job. They're so precious in that standpoint, that people are reticent to really to take the time to measure the efficiency of one maintenance person versus another. This person's getting 3.5 work orders done on a day. You're getting 2.2. Like, why is that? I rarely hear people talk about that. There's no reason it can't be measured right now. I think with, every work order software is able to say who did the, which kind of work orders and how much time did it take them. But I've never heard anybody actually dive into that. That's interesting. You mentioned a couple other things that I want to pull out. We're always trying to give some operational guidance to folks here at the Academy. People are here to learn. And you did mention two things. When you talk about not centralization, we'll talk about it as operational efficiencies. There are some things that you can do right now that make sense. Centralizing contracts. If you still have on-site folks signing contracts, reviewing contracts, and then stuffing them in a drawer somewhere, that's bad, right? We should be well beyond that. So that's one really easy duty that you can pull from local and centralize somewhere. And then what was the other one you mentioned? Sorry, it was contracts and something else you mentioned.
Purchasing.
Yeah, purchasing. Now,
Like appliances.
Now, harder purchasing is probably a whole discussion. We have a show just on purchasing. Purchasing very difficult. I would say because of the kind of the wide range of things one needs to purchase. It's hard to standardize. I know companies have said, we are only going to buy coal version, whatever things for all of our, that just doesn't work. Like, not every unit's the same, not every property is the same. And so there's software, the PMS platforms allow this, another third party, where you can like limit the things you can purchase. And then if it's over budget, you got to get approvals, but it's an emergency. Like, there's just a lot of, there's a lot to handle in sort of centralizing purchasing. Have you cracked that code, Moshe, or is that still a work in progress?
That is very much a work in progress. But I say very much a work, like we have a lot of work to do in that process. We're not well into that. We're just getting there. And again, all these things were uncovered when you start to compare property to property. You're like, well, why is the capex so much higher on this property than another property? And then you're like, well, this one lost so many hot water heater, had to replace so many hot water heaters. And then I was like, well, do we have the right things in place to measure this stuff so that we could forecast this and predict? And what's the average lifespan of the hot water, and and then collect all the data for what the lifespan of them, and what how old they are, and then you could kind of project we're going to be starting to replace these in 5 years or in 2 years, and plan accordingly. So that opened our eyes to be one to look at that. And then you just have you know if you have a centralized process in terms of purchasing, maybe just like that analogy, I was telling you about this company where there's one person, a team of three who's answering all the leads, and then another team who's doing the closing the deal, and another person who's doing you want maintenance doing maintenance on site, right? So all these other the things that fall onto maintenance that has nothing to do with turning a unit or making a repair and completing a work order. I would imagine you would want a team or someone who specializes in those things handling those decisions.
Yes, right. Well, and you have just touched on another bugaboo of mine, actually, which is the idea of asset tracking. So if you want to do some of the things which you just mentioned, which all sound wonderful, I would love to know which brand of water heater I'm getting actual 7 years of life out of, and which ones I'm only getting 3. I would love to see the recurrence of work orders when a certain kind of, I don't know, um, heater that, this one's just more problematic than the other. I'd love to do all that. And we have clients or prospects that come to Leonardo from time to time, and they say, do you have an asset track? We want to use asset tracking. We want to answer all these questions. And and now that sounds good, but when you start to peel away the onion on what it takes to accomplish that, nobody wants to go through what it takes uh, to classify, to capture and classify all the existing equipment they have on site. To go through and catalog it and figure out what you have so you can start that process is a daunting task for everybody. I've never met any client who's once presented with that, it's like, oh yeah, we're prepared to scrub every unit in every property and develop a proper catalog of assets. And then once that's done,
Well, can I interrupt
diligent.
for a second?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Is that if a person would just say, let's just start for this year 2024, we're going to log what appliances we replace, right? I would imagine at the end of 2024 there would be, you can narrow it down to like 3 or 4, fridges, your dishwasher and oven, that those are going to be the most expensive and the most common. You don't need to tag everything, but if you just when you get on the scale and you weigh yourself, you have a starting point. So if you just start by some sort of processing, like what are we even replacing before, and then we could figure out like a starting point of what we need to actually tag versus saying we need to tag everything.
Just going forward, we're going to draw a line in the sand, and in 5 years from now, we can start looking at trends that are meaningful.
You start a starting point. I mean, when we started this whole expense audit project, originally, the president thought we were just going to be focusing on the DOE and capex, and once we were doing it, it's like we should be doing this for all categories. And there were so many things that were interesting in these other categories that were not on our radar at all: utilities and payroll and general admin, and again, until you could guess, right? So it's like that. Think again, like instead of just accepting that it just might be whatever our gut feeling is. How many work orders? We just started tracking the number of work orders per property, and it was like, whoa, why is this property so much lower, or this one's so much higher? And then there were certain things that just made a lot of sense. But you just need a starting point to say, okay, this, and it will lead you to a lot of things. So instead of saying, okay, we need to track every single piece appliance that could be replaced, you don't need to start with that. Just start tracking what you're replacing, and then from there it will tell you a story of, okay, these are important to track. Let's start. This is a starting point.
Yes, I agree with that. The predicate to be able to do that is then I think, you must have the purchasing piece solved, so that the data about the equipment that you're buying gets pulled in an automatic fashion, and you're not relying or forcing your site teams to like, okay, just install this boiler. I'm gonna like type in the the VIN number, the number of the equipment. I'm gonna type in the color, like that will become too much of a burden, I think, for people to actually do that on a recurring basis. So you're going to need, I think, to solve that piece technically with the purchasing solution that is very hard to assemble right now, in my opinion.
And there's a whole nother
You
part.
did say something.
Sorry, one more
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, go ahead.
There's a fair amount of players in the industry that don't even care about that because they're not long-term holders.
Oh, right. Great point.
You
Yes.
purchase a
Your
property.
typical 3 to 5 year. Yes. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
They purchase a property and they're going to sell it in 5 to 7 years or something like that. They don't care about the long term, and so they're not going to go through a project like this. We're typically long-term holders, so we're thinking like this right now. Nothing's on the market for us to sell, and we can't imagine selling anything. Now, usually when somebody says that, they turn around and they sell something. But no, in this case, like we're not actually. We've sold. Since I started here, we sold some of our older properties. I was talking about at the beginning. The Class C stuff in Baltimore and things like that. But we've only sold one other deal that we bought it in 2017 and we sold it last year. And the reason was it was smaller. When we bought it, we were still growing. Now we've been buying properties more than 300 units. It was under 300 units. It was not as efficient for us to operate, and that's why we sold it.
Yeah. This is a very good point to just expand on a little bit. It's sort of like some people in real estate are playing. Remember that game where the kids game where there was the hippo in the middle and you had to like put your finger in on one of his teeth to see if the hippo was going to close on you and bite you. It's like some people treat real estate that way. Like, I'm only going to hold this asset for 3 years. That's my pro forma. I'm going to not really pay attention to a lot of the things that speak to asset longevity. And I'm just going to push the tooth on the hippo and hope that I don't get bit and have to replace all of my water heater, chiller, whatever systems during my tenure. I want to revamp, rehab, put in the stainless steel appliances, sell to somebody else, keep my fingers crossed during that time that nothing bad's going to happen. I mean, that is a legit operating model for sure. And maybe why we don't see wider adoption or demand for some of these things. You mentioned a couple of things that I want to bring out as well. You talked about centralization of screening, I think, which also makes sense. Do you want to expand on that at all? How one accomplishes that, or are there any challenges to doing that?
I don't have the answer, but if you just think about, you have 25 leasing agents in a portfolio for a company, there's a lot of risk having them each manage the screening process versus if you have one person who's doing all that. Like if something's wrong with the screening, it's one person you need to address, right? If something goes wrong with the screening and you have 25 people and there is higher turnover at leasing, so you're retraining people. Some of your people are going to be brand new at every point during the year. Um, there's a risk factor there. And if you have one person, and I think that screening itself, there's so many products that are putting a band-aid on it. You have your screening, and then you have somebody who's scanning the documents to make sure that they're not fraud, and you have somebody else who's checking the IDs. It feels like there should be a better one-stop shop that does all of that: the screening, the rental verification, employee verification, and all that, and gives you the answer versus plugging in all these tools.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, LLMs and GPTs will do a better job with taking destructured data, like what comes in like these verification forms that people submit, and sussing out whether they're legit or not. That probably will get much better in the next few years. Um, one other thing I want to mention that do you think anybody on the centralization operational efficiency, do you think anybody's still doing accounting locally, or have an industry? Do you think we've all centralized that piece? Because that should be table stakes. Yeah.
I again, the industry is very fragmented in that regard, and there's no one source that tells you. My hunch is that there are probably some old school companies that, on their larger properties, are still doing the accounting on site.
Yeah. Yeah. That I think should be table stakes. That stuff should not be handled locally. That's so easy. Invoicing, so many great tools to do invoicing locally. All right. We're going way over time, but I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm not done yet. I want to turn to your discussion about maintenance and turn it over to you here to talk about in your quest, since that's your passion now. What is the thing you're seeking to solve most urgently on the maintenance front, and then what do you wish existed that you have so far found does not exist?
Well, I would say I think the biggest competitive advantage that can be is if we can successfully create an apprentice program and we could hire people who have no experience in maintenance and we could train them and develop them and place them within our portfolio and create our own pool of talent that way. We've been doing that with leasing. My I got involved with the hiring process back in 2021, and my outlook was if we hire people who have no experience, we're going to have a longer runway for them to grow and develop, and there's a better chance that they'll be around to be promoted to leasing manager, assistant manager, eventually property manager. I think of it like a sports team that you want to grow organically within your organization versus bringing people in from outside for these higher positions. And I think that maintenance is the same thing. So we're trying to figure that out. We're far from that. Well, I shouldn't say we're far from that, but we have a few properties that are close proximity. We have a regional maintenance supervisor over there that's working on creating a program, and we're anxiously waiting to test this out, to hire somebody again who has no experience, see how long it takes us to ramp him up. And if we could figure that out, I think the future of all of our maintenance hires would come through a program like that. And the success, just you're going to have people who stick around longer. I would imagine that leasing has a fair amount of turnover. Maintenance probably has a higher percentage of turnover, and it probably takes longer to place for those positions than any other position in your operations. So that to me is the golden goose that can lay golden eggs.
Do you think the trade organizations NAA, NMHC could should play a role in doing that, establishing a centralized training center for maintenance?
I think some of them have tried it. I don't know their success. No, it's there's each association is going to be different. Some of the associations, they have people on their team that were property managers or community managers, and they have good ideas, but they're not in place to run a program like this. And some organizations are completely different, and they have the best and brightest people in their industry who are running these programs, and maybe there are programs like this that exist and are successful. So I don't know, I couldn't tell you. I don't think that we're not relying on one of these big organizations to do something like that to solve that problem for us. I think it's, first of all, I think the problem is too big for them, meaning they can't be doing this for, they don't have enough to do that for all hires in the industry.
Well, if it were a profit center for them, um, you know,
Oh, I don't doubt that the incentive and the reason and all that is there, but I'm saying there's so many, whatever number of positions of maintenance, it's a lot more feasible, for us to create that and to do that. We have, I don't know, 50 maintenance people than for, the local association trying to do that, to take, 500 maintenance folks who've never worked in maintenance and train them and place them.
yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that. I think I would find it much more daunting. So in a previous life, I owned and managed a company that um, had about 3,000 residential units, multifamily units, and like we could not have pulled off a centralized training. Like we could not have carried that overhead. I don't know how big of a company you need to be able to carry the kind of overhead where you can continuously train people, to have a bench of people that when you need a maintenance person, like you've got somebody, okay, well, they're ready to come. Like, how do you do that at scale?
I don't know, but I don't think it's like we're not bringing in a class of 10 and then, training them and wrapping them up and then waiting to place them. We're starting with one person. And if we could prove the concept and we could do that, then let's hire another person. And within 3 months, we're going to have another position likely for them to fill. And so I think it's a one by one versus, bringing in 10 people and having them wait around until there's a position.
Well, I don't know if we're starting a company here together, Moshe, but the entrepreneur in me senses something. But It is, when you talk about efficiency, far more efficient to have a head of training who's training 10 or 20 people at a time than a one-to-one sort of scenario. So while to do what you're doing, I think should be lauded, I think it's very expensive for you to do a one-on-one. It would be much better if you could spread that cost over 10 or 20 people you're training, all in the classroom at the same time. Here's what the boiler looks like, not like this one-on-one kind of scenario. And so that's why I feel like it's harder to pull off at smaller scale than it is large scale. Another show, I guess. I do have to let you go, and short attention spans are short with podcasts. We probably already exceeded what people will listen to, although they're probably very interested in hear what you have to say. So hopefully we've kept people's attention. But is there anything else in closing, Moshe, that's on your mind with respect to maintenance that you want to share, something you've learned that people can implement right now to make maintenance better?
Well, I would say just like any other position, you don't get in shape by working out once. And as companies, we have, quarterly meetings or workshops for property management teams, maybe our leasing teams. One of our properties has a monthly lunch and learn, and their home maintenance staff, they have a topic that they're learning. It might even just be watching a YouTube video, but I think that we need to invest more effort, and it doesn't have to be cost a lot of money, but just time and effort into our maintenance teams. And you have someone who comes in as a maintenance tech, and they work up and they become a manager, but who trained them how to lead, and who trained them how to manage people, and who trained them how to hire people? And I think there's a lot more. Just even soft skills, like how to be a good employee, how to be hungry, how to what's professional, what's not professional. I think there's a lot that can be done, attention that could be given to maintenance that's not even complicated, and you don't have to sell somebody on some big program. It just, so we're looking to roll these lunch and learns out monthly at all of our properties for maintenance, and there's good camaraderie. They get together, they get a lunch. It's good bonding time, and you're trying to learn something, and it's creating this attitude and a culture of wanting to, of hungry, of, we want to learn more, we want to get better and do more.
Yeah, important on a lot of fronts. I love the cultural aspect of that you mentioned. A lot of times in this industry, our folks on site are just siloed, and they hardly ever get to see anybody else. So that alone makes them feel greater connection with Sage, I'm sure, and then they learn something along the way. So I love that idea. Well, Professor Crane, a wonderful lecture today. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of this. We will continue to watch in earnest other intellectual questions that you pose on LinkedIn. How would you prefer people try to connect with you if they're interested in talking to you about Sage Ventures or just some of the other things? Like maybe someone's got a solution for you they want to present. How do we get a hold of you?
LinkedIn is the best place. I'm not great with email, but if somebody wants to email me, it's my first initial M, last name Crane @sageventures.com. But LinkedIn is a better channel for that.
Right on. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us here in the classroom today. I really appreciated it. And I'm sure I will see you at the next trade show.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm sure the class is ready for lunch. So I hope we didn't go over too long.
You went over a little bit. All right. Take care. Thanks, Moshe. Thank you for joining us at this week's episode of the Apartment Academy podcast. The Apartment Academy is a production of Leonardo 24/7, the industry's leader in multifamily operations and maintenance software. At Apartment Academy, we realize the hard work that goes into property management and the stress that comes along with it. Leonardo 24/7 takes the guesswork out of your team's day-to-day by providing customized daily guidance on tasks that need to be done, guaranteeing consistent operations across your entire portfolio. To learn more, visit www.leonardo247.com today.